In this video, we're going to study the basics of the circulatory system. We're going to take a look at the anatomy and the flow of blood through the heart and through the body. So again, we studied many organ systems in grade 11 biology. We focused on respiratory and digestive initially. Remember that digestive helps us to get the fuel for cellular respiration, for example, the glucose and other organic molecules, whereas respiratory helps us to bring in the oxygen into our body using the lungs and the alveoli in the lungs. And now once we have both these ingredients into the body, we have the products of cellular respiration, or the reactants of cellular respiration given to us. Now we just need to deliver these reactants throughout the body cells so that cellular respiration can happen. And the system that's going to help with that delivery is the circulatory system. So please make sure you review cellular respiration, its equation, and understand how the different systems we're studying will help to contribute to the process of cellular respiration in our bodies. This is simply a review slide for the process of cellular respiration. Please make sure you go over it, understand where these ingredients are coming from, and which systems are responsible for them, and also which systems will be doing the delivery. Once again, another review slide for cellular respiration. So this is really the main image that summarizes everything that we've seen so far, and it establishes a good connection between the respiratory system and the circulatory system. You can see here that oxygen is coming into the body and going into the lungs, and there's going to be a gas exchange, and that oxygen is going to go into our blood vessels, and then in the blood vessels it can be delivered to cells, and then into the mitochondria of cells, or mitochondrion if you're saying singular. And at the same time, somewhere else through the digestive system, some glucose might have been delivered as well. So you might have had some glucose delivered. And now the mitochondrion has glucose and oxygen, and it can do cellular respiration. And so what it's going to do is it's going to do cellular respiration, produce that ATP for us so we can do work. But there's going to be some waste produced, and some of that waste is carbon dioxide. That goes back into the bloodstream, delivered back to your lungs, to the alveoli, and then you breathe that out. So what we've just seen here is a connection between the respiratory system and circulatory system, and I've just added in the digestive system as well. Notice that all the systems are connected through these very small blood vessels called capillaries, which basically absorb the ingredients that we're trying to obtain for cellular respiration. And so you can see this that same concept just illustrated here. Here we have a blood vessel next to a cell. You don't need to memorize all these other terms like pyruvate and lactic acid right now. That you'll have to do in grade 12. But our blood vessel here, you can see there's some glucose and there's some oxygen carried on this molecule called hemoglobin from the red blood cell. And that oxygen is going into the cell, diffusing into the cell. The glucose is going into the cell as well. And then they're going into the mitochondrion to do cellular respiration, to make us ATP. This came from digestive, this came from respiratory, and this process here is a circulatory system. And over here you can see the waste product going back into the blood to be delivered to the lungs so we can breathe it out. So the circulatory system does many things. The main function is transport of materials, like, as we mentioned, oxygen, nutrients, also hormones. We talked about hormones such as insulin and glucagon, and also to get rid of waste products from the body. So carbon dioxide can be put into the blood, so it can be delivered to the lungs and we get rid of it. So there's many functions that the circulatory system has. It's a very important system, like many others. And the main parts of the circulatory system are the veins, arteries, capillaries, which are basically the blood vessels. There's also other little categories of them, but the blood vessels. The blood itself, which is a tissue. And then, of course, the pump or the organ of the circulatory system is the heart. So the three main functions of the circulatory system includes transporting gases, for example, from the respiratory system, transporting nutrients, and also waste materials. So transport, that's the main idea there. Also regulating the body temperature. So regulating body temperature. So when, for example, when you get too hot, you might see your blood vessels, your veins protrude, or they look bigger. And that's because more blood's flowing to the surface there to release heat from your body. And when you're cold, well, those veins, those vessels might constrict to conserve heat. So they do help to regulate the body temperature. They also help to transport chemicals such as hormones that are important for regulating other things in your body. And the other thing is that the circulatory system also has a protective factor. It does protect you from injury. So, for example, you might have heard scabbing before. So when you get a cut, a scab develops to prevent you from bleeding out, essentially. And it also fights, well, diseases. So there are some blood cells in your body that will help to protect you against diseases and other toxic substances. So main functions: transport, regulation of internal temperature, and protection factors. So before we go into the full detail of our circulatory system, I want to discuss two main types of circulatory systems that exist. There's an open circulatory system and a closed circulatory system. So we'll start with the open circulatory system. You're going to see that in arthropods and most mollusks as well. The blood in open circulatory systems is not confined to, well, vessels. You'll notice here, for example, you have the heart, so you have a pump, and it pumps the blood throughout these little tubes, kind of like vessels, but they're not closed off. The blood can actually come out and surround the tissues and the cells and the organs, and then deliver nutrients that way. They're not stuck in these vessels like you would see in a closed system. In a closed system, the blood would be stuck in these blood vessels over here. So the main thing is that blood is not contained in vessels. It actually surrounds and bathes the organs and tissues and delivers nutrients to them. The other important thing is, so in a scientific way to say that, is they make direct contact with the organs and tissues. The other important difference is that there's this thing called interstitial fluid. It's fluid that surrounds cells. And so in an open circulatory system, the interstitial fluid and the blood, they mix together, and that's called hemolymph. They're allowed to mix because the blood is not contained to blood vessels specifically. So it's really the hemolymph that's kind of pumped around and then delivered out to directly contact the organs and tissues to deliver nutrients. And that cycle kind of happens over and over again. So nutrients are delivered to cells and organs and tissues, goes back to the heart to be pumped through these little tubes here, and then they come out again and surround and directly contact the cells, organs, and tissues, and you can see that over here as well. So you can see kind of a zoom in or zoom out view of the hemolymph leaving and then going back in, and then leaving and going back in, and that just happens over and over and over again. And so this is the open circulatory system of a grasshopper, an example of an arthropod. That brings back some memories with the diversity unit. So the other type of system is a closed system. And the closed system, you'll find them in annelids, cephalopods, and all vertebrates, including humans. And the difference between the closed and the open is that in the closed system, the blood is contained within blood vessels, little tubes here. And it actually doesn't mix with the interstitial fluid. So we don't have, for example, hemolymph. Okay? And so what happens is you have a heart, again, kind of like we saw with the open system. It pumps the blood. The blood does not leave these tubes. The blood will go into smaller vessels and then do some exchange with the surrounding organs and tissues. But the blood never came into direct contact with the surrounding organs and tissues. It did some diffusion and types of transport. When you need more pressure, more nutrients, you can travel around your areas and go back to the heart to be pumped once again throughout the body. But again, the blood stayed within the vessels, so that's how we call it a closed system, and it does not mix with the interstitial fluid. Now, what's the point of having these different systems? Why have a closed system? Why not just have an open system? Well, there is an advantage to a closed system, especially if you're a larger or more active animal or organism. You need blood to be delivered more effectively. You need blood to be regulated more effectively as well. And so this system, the closed system, has a higher pressure to it, and so that leads to more efficient, effective distribution of the blood throughout the body, and it allows you to be, well, to actually sustain a larger body and to sustain more active activity, or more activity overall. But if you're a smaller organism, maybe like an arthropod or some sort of or other insect, you maybe don't need that high pressure. Because you might not be as active and you might not be as large. So it would be a bit of a trade-off. the high pressure system, one of its disadvantages is that it requires more energy. So if you're a smaller organism and you don't move around that much, you probably don't want to waste too much energy on your circulatory system, and an open one's fine. But if you're a larger organism, or you're very active, a higher pressure system is probably a little bit better for you, since that pressure is more effective at delivering things throughout. Now, if you look at a closed system, one really interesting thing, especially in humans, is this little statement here. The total length of the blood vessels in an average human adult is twice the Earth's circumference at the equator. That's amazing. All that stuff just stuffed into our human bodies. And it's such a large amount of it. We saw it with the intestines, and if you thought that was impressive, this is impressive over here as well. So our main focus in this lesson will be about closed circulatory systems, because that's what we have. So again, we saw closed versus open circulatory systems. We saw the differences between them, but despite differences, there are similarities. They do have a fluid that transports stuff throughout the body, so hemolymph and blood. And then they also have tubes. They have some kind of tubes that help to circulate things. It's just that in the open one, the tubes are open and they allow the fluid to leave. In the closed one, the tubes are not open, and so the fluid can't leave. And they also have a pump. So we saw that in both systems there's a heart. The main difference is that one's closed, one is open. So closed systems are very, very efficient. In a closed system, the blood can do a complete circuit, so go all the way around and back to where it started in about 1 minute. And we call our closed system the cardiovascular system, cardia for heart. Okay, cardiovascular system, and the vas means the vessel. So there's three main components that we're going to be studying in detail before we go into the flow of blood throughout the heart and the body. We're going to be studying the blood, the heart, and the different types of vessels. An interesting note is that in us, there's about 4 to 5 liters of blood in humans. So we're going to start off by studying the blood. Remember that the blood is a tissue. It's a fluid connective tissue. It's very, very specialized. It has a few different parts to it. One of its parts is fluid, so that's the non-living part, and that's about 55% of it. And that's called the plasma. So if you look here at this test tube, this is our plasma. It has water, dissolved salts, proteins, other substances like nutrients, some waste, some oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hormones. So that is what makes up the plasma, which is 55% of your blood. You also have the cellular part, which is 45% of your blood, and that's the living part. And it contains things like red blood cells, white blood cells, and also platelets. So if you look at this test tube here, what happened is this test tube was spun really, really, really fast, and that's called the centrifuge. So a centrifuge spun this test tube extremely fast, and the purpose of doing that is to separate things. The idea is that the more dense stuff collects at the bottom, and the less dense stuff collects at the top. So as you can see, the cellular components are more dense, they're at the bottom, and the plasma components are less dense, they're at the top. And this is especially useful if you want to separate certain cells from others, or certain components for others, to remove them and study them specifically. So major functions of our blood: transport, that's super important. So whether it be oxygen, water, nutrients, and other chemicals like hormones, removing waste products like carbon dioxide, for example, and also regulating body temperature, healing wounds, and also fighting infections. So we're going to take a look at the different cells, different parts, and what they do. Okay, so this is a general overview of the blood. It's a tissue. There's 2 parts to it. There's the fluid part, which is called the plasma, and that's 55% of your blood. It's less dense right on top here. There's the cellular part, 45% of your blood. It's living, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Make sure you know the functions very well. And you should be able to label a picture like this. You should know which is more dense, which is less dense, and what the different parts are made up of. So we'll start off with the blood plasma. Again, that's 55% of your blood volume. And 90% of it's actually water, so that helps to control the body temperature. The water also helps to dissolve things as well. It helps with the transport of many things. The last 10% of it is made up of proteins, nutrients, ions, and waste products. And those do various functions. We'll take a look at that on the next slide. For example, plasma proteins help to transport some fatty acids and vitamins. They might help to fight off infections. But there's a few other different functions as well that you'll take a look at in the next slide. There's a nice table that summarizes all of the major functions of the different components. So you can see that here. These are the components of the blood plasma, the water, plasma proteins, and the salts. So you should know a general idea of what each of them does. You don't have to memorize every single one, but I would focus on maybe one from each to make sure you know that they all do serve a purpose at some point in time. So now we get to our red blood cells. So red blood cells is part of the cellular component. It's only one of the parts. They're also called erythrocytes, so remember that. Sometimes I might use that term on a test, quiz, or assessment or interview rather than red blood cell. And sometimes I abbreviate red blood cell as RBC, not Royal Bank of Canada, but red blood cell. And they come from these special cells in your bone marrow called stem cells. They actually make up the majority of your cellular component, and the main function, there's others, but the main function is to transport oxygen. And their shape really allows them to do a good job at that. So they're biconcave, which basically means they're thinner in the middle than they are on the outside. And they have a very large surface area, which allows them to carry more oxygen. The other thing they have are these things called hemoglobin proteins, which contain a heme group with iron in it. And that really helps to bind oxygen quite well. So this is important here, understanding how this structure really allows it to accomplish its function. So each hemoglobin can actually bind 4 oxygens. Each hemoglobin can bind 4 oxygens. And so what that means is that each red blood cell can hold 1 billion oxygens. How do we get to that? Well, if you look at this number here, there's 250 million hemoglobin proteins on a red blood cell, on one red blood cell. And so if you have 250 million hemoglobin proteins on a red blood cell, and each of those can bind 4 oxygen, you can hold 1 billion oxygen molecules. That's quite a bit. They're very thin and flexible. That's another important feature. They can go through very small vessels because they're thin and flexible. And also, they don't have a nucleus, which is quite interesting. So while they're being produced in the stem cell, they go through this process called enucleation, where they basically just spit out their nucleus. And they don't have mitochondria either. And so that's actually important. No nucleus means they have more space to carry oxygen. And then no mitochondria means they're not using up oxygen because they're not doing cellular respiration, which is great. So again, this is a very, very important slide because it really goes over the idea of structure supporting function. The function of these red blood cells is primarily to transport oxygen. And you need to have the right structure to do that. So red blood cells are built to do that job very efficiently and effectively. So do focus on the slide. That is very important. So red blood cells, just a little note about them. So here we just zoomed in and we took a look at the hemoglobin. And then each hemoglobin has a heme with an iron in it to help it bind oxygen. Remember that because there's no nucleus, there's more room to hold oxygen, but that also has a few other implications to it. It means that red blood cells actually can't replace proteins when they're gone. Red blood cells don't grow anymore. Red blood cells don't divide because they don't have that DNA to really tell them what to do. So they don't live for very long. They actually only live for about 100 to 120 days. And then when they die, you can reuse their parts, like the iron, for example, to make new red blood cells from the stem cells. So signals will be sent out to basically say, okay, red blood cells are kind of low, we need some more, make some more for us, and that whole process will happen again. They'll get rid of the nucleus, the mitochondria, and synthesize necessary proteins, and before they get rid of the nucleus, of course, and then they'll have more red blood cells to do the job. The other thing is, even though red blood cells don't do cellular respiration, because they don't have mitochondria, they do still make their own ATP because they still need that energy to do work, but they use another process called anaerobic respiration, which basically means cellular respiration without oxygen. I shouldn't say cellular respiration, I should just say respiration without oxygen. So they still do produce some ATP. But again, the main point is they don't live very long, they don't have a nucleus, they don't have mitochondria, we replace them very frequently, about about every 100 to 120 days is when we'll replace them through the stem cell bank in our body. So now we get to our white blood cells. Another name for the white blood cells are the leukocytes. And so the leukocytes, again, they're another part of the cellular component. So we saw red blood cells already. Now we're at the white blood cells. And what are their main functions? Oh, and just like the red blood cells, by the way, they're also made in the bone marrow, okay, from stem cells. So you can think of stem cells as unspecialized cells that basically turn into different cells when we want them to. So they can turn into red blood cells, white blood cells, and a few other things. They help to guard against infections. They play a big role in our immune system. Okay, a big role in our immune system. Now, the red blood cells, they have to stay in the blood vessels, but the white blood cells, they actually don't have to stay in the blood vessels. And also, they keep their nuclei, and they live for many, many more years than the red blood cells do. Some white blood cells are phagocytic red blood cells. What that means is basically, white blood cells. What that basically means is that they can go around, extend their membrane, and swallow dangerous things like bacteria, bring them into the cell, and then afterwards destroy them. And that's a process called phagocytosis. Phagocytosis. Basically means that you engulf, swallow dangerous things, take them in, and then break them down. Okay, and you break them down. So red blood cells are well suited for their structure, for their function. They're well structured for their function, I should say. They live longer. They still have their nucleus. They don't have to be contained within blood vessels, and they live for many years, like I said already. They can do phagocytosis, which basically means they extend those pseudopodia to grab dangerous things and then destroy them. And so one really cool thing that you might have heard of before is something called pus. When you have pus coming out of a wound, that's actually a mixture of white blood cells and the bacteria that they try to destroy. Then we get to platelets. Platelets are really just pieces of cells. They're cell fragments, and they basically form when you have larger cells in the bone marrow breaking apart. Platelets, kind of like red blood cells, they don't contain nuclei, so they're similar in that respect. And what they do is, after they form, if you haven't used them, they'll break down within 7 to 10 days, so they don't even last very long. But what they're very important for is they're kind of like your natural band-aid. When you get a wound, platelets will play a role in clotting blood. So it'll kind of thicken the blood at the site of injury to prevent excessive blood loss. So again, that's why we sometimes call them the natural band-aid. You can see it over here, there's a wound, and you can see platelets and other cells kind of grouping together to patch up that wound so blood does not drift out. But again, this is part of the cellular component. So we saw the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. We're going to take a look at how a scab forms. A scab is really just, or even just a clot first. A clot is just really, again, that natural band-aid. And if that clot makes its way to the surface, you get that hard little area of blood, and that's when we call it a scab. So let's look at blood clotting, the process and how it works. So here we have the image of how blood clotting works. And the idea is that you have an injured area, so an injured blood vessel, and that will release chemicals to basically attract platelets to that area of injury. And so platelets will find their way there. And what will happen when the platelets get there is the platelets will actually break, they'll rupture, and they'll release other chemicals that will combine with other chemicals in the plasma to produce this enzyme called PTA, or sometimes we call it thromboplastin. And so you can see that over here. Okay, so that first step, platelets came. Second step, they rupture to release chemicals to make PTA. Now, as long as there's calcium present, the PTA is going to react with something called prothrombin. And so prothrombin is actually made by the liver. And what's going to happen is that's going to lead to the production of something called thrombin. And thrombin is another enzyme. Now, thrombin is going to go and react with something called fibrinogen, which is a plasma protein, and that's going to produce fibrin, which is going to help to seal off the wounds. And fibrin is just an insoluble protein, so it's not going to be dissolved in water or anything like that. It's going to kind of glue everything together, stick everything together, and here you have your blood clot. So we have our platelets. We also have some trapped red blood cells in there too, because they kind of get in the way. But that's the general idea. So we attract some platelets to the wound site. This whole pathway happens where we produce some enzymes to produce fibrinogen, and then that fibrinogen is going to produce fibrin fibers, which basically are insoluble proteins that help stick stuff together, and there we have our natural band-aid that was produced. When this natural band-aid reaches the surface of the skin, we call it a scab. As previously mentioned, these different cellular components of the blood come from the bone marrow. So that's the red blood cells, the white blood cells, the platelets. They all come from the bone marrow, from these stem cells. They're multipotent stem cells, which basically means that they're not fully unspecialized. They're a little bit specialized, but not so specialized that they can't transform into other things. If you're fully specialized, you're done transforming. You're just stuck doing your role all the time. These multipotent stem cells in the bone marrow, they're kind of specialized in that they're really only working to produce a few types of cells. If you were completely unspecialized, we would call you pluripotent, and that means you can basically become the majority of cells in the body. There's actually something else called totipotent, which you may have learned about in grade 10. If you are interested, you can read about that in more detail in your textbook or online. But the main idea here is that we have our stem cell in the bone marrow, and when it's given signals, it can become the erythrocytes, platelets, and the white blood cells. And there's different names for some of the white blood cells. You might see neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, and monocytes as well. So one of the signals for red blood cells, for example, is this thing called erythropoietin, and we sometimes just call it EPO, and it will signal the bone marrow cells to make more red blood cells, for example, when oxygen is low or when we need more red blood cells in general. And so you don't have to memorize this whole process here, but just to show you that biology kind of it looks a little complicated at first, but once you understand how to read one of these diagrams, it's very straightforward. It's basically a diagram that shows you, okay, where's the signal coming from? What is the signal allowing us to produce? So it's the idea that we get this signal, EPO over here, erythropoietin. It will bind to a receptor on a bone marrow cell. So this is the EPO receptor, and then that will trigger some kind of reaction and cascade and events in here to basically produce some red blood cells. And all this other stuff here was essentially how the signal is first propagated throughout the cell. So you don't have to memorize it, but just get that there are cell signals that tell your body when to make different things. And one of the signals to make red blood cells is this EPO over here. This is a summary of what we've seen so far. So we saw the plasma, 55% of the blood volume, and the cellular component, which is 45% of the blood volume. We saw the red blood cells called erythrocytes, the white blood cells called the leukocytes, and there's different types of white blood cells that you can see over here, many different types with different shapes, different structures, and maybe slightly different functions as a result of that. We see our platelets over here. We saw the main functions of those, and we also saw the main functions of the different components of the plasma as well. So do make sure that you understand the different parts, plasma versus cellular, and also the different components of each of the major components as well. Again, this is just another summary slide from your textbook that goes over the different portions that we saw. You don't need to memorize all these numbers. I mean, it's good to have a nice sense of the numbers. So for example, we said that water was the biggest part of the blood plasma. We said that plasma is 55% of the blood volume. We said that the cellular portion is 45% of the blood volume. We said that the erythrocytes made up the largest component of the cellular part. So those are things you should know. But these other numbers about how many neutrophils there are, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils, you don't really need to know those numbers there. Know the major roles, as we discussed. If there's a lot of them, focus on one major one. If there's only one, just focus on the one. So now we're going to focus on the blood vessels. So the blood vessels are the part that contain the blood. And so there's three main types of blood vessels. We have arteries and arterioles. We have veins and venules, and we have capillaries. And so we're going to see the structure of all of these. Now, what all of these blood vessels share in common is they have an innermost layer called an endothelium. Endo for inner, endothelium. Now, capillaries, they're very, very small. So they just have one more layer above the endothelium, so one more layer, and that's called the basal lamina. So really, two layers, endothelium and basal lamina. Now, arteries and veins, they have two layers that surround the endothelium. Capillaries, one layer, arteries and vein, two layers that surround the endothelium instead of just one like in the capillaries. And so the way that blood flow works, and you should understand this, is that, so here we have our heart. You'll notice that blood is first pumped out of the heart into these large arteries, and then the large arteries become smaller arteries, and then those get even smaller and are called arterioles, and then those get even smaller and smaller and smaller, and we call those capillaries. Now, once we get out of the capillaries, after exchange and all that stuff happens, the blood needs to get back to the heart, so we get into these slightly bigger vessels than the capillaries. They're called venules. Those venules will get larger and larger and larger and become smaller veins, and those smaller veins will get larger and become the larger veins, which lead back to the heart. So you're basically larger the closer you are to the heart, and smaller when you're farther away from the heart in terms of a blood vessel. So that's the blood flow: large arteries, smaller arteries to the arterioles, and then capillaries, and then venules, smaller veins, large veins, heart, and then back to large artery. So it's a cycle that happens over and over again. This is just a simplified example of the blood flow in our closed circulatory system. So you do need to know the difference between arteries and veins. As you know, they are bigger than capillaries. Arteries have a thick, muscular, and elastic wall, and they have a smaller internal diameter because they're so thick. So there's internal diameter smaller, but that's because they're so thick and muscular, and they have elastic walls. The veins have thin walls. Now, in terms of the type of blood they carry, well, arteries carry high pressure blood, and they carry that blood away from the heart, So they're the kind of the first vessel that the blood encounters when leaving the heart after it was first pumped. And so if it was first pumped there, it's going to be high pressure. The veins, on the other hand, they carry low pressure blood, and they carry that towards the heart. It's basically the vessel connected to the heart on the other side when the blood comes back and is slowed down. So it's kind of like at the end of a roller coaster ride. You slow down, you come back. So low pressure blood. And the blood flow in arteries depends on the pump, which is the heart. And since the heart pumps that blood and it's high pressure, arteries don't need valves. They don't need little caps to prevent blood from going backwards because that pressure is strong enough to make it go in one direction. In fact, what you actually feel when you take a pulse is that high pressure blood going through arteries. So when you take a pulse, you're feeling an artery, not a vein. The veins, because their blood is low pressure, they need valves. So little flaps of tissue that will prevent backflow. So if the blood goes this way at low pressure, it could go backwards, but because that flap is there, it'll prevent the blood from going backwards. Whereas these arteries don't really need that because they carry high pressure blood. So again, you can see that they're both larger than capillaries. The arteries have thicker and more elastic walls. They have high pressure blood that carries blood away. So arteries, think away, and veins towards the heart. I often like to think of this, if you've ever taken French, when you tell someone to come towards you, you say viens. That means come here. Viens, viens ici. So it looks like vein to me, and so I'm telling it to come towards me. That's a trick I use. If you have other tricks, please feel free to use those. So here we can see a summary of what we've seen so far. The arteries and the veins in their multiple layers. We can see the blood flow from the arteries into smaller arteries, into arterioles, into capillaries. We can then see venules, small veins, and then larger veins, and then back to the heart, which would pump it again through here again. You can see there's also a change in color happening. That'll be important later on. But the idea is that when blood is pumped out of your heart to the body, the blood will contain oxygen. When it goes into the capillaries, the oxygen will be delivered to cells and organs and tissues, and so you lose the oxygen, and the blue signifies that. The blue signifies that you've gotten rid of oxygen and you have to return to the heart to go somehow to the lungs to get oxygen again. But that's what the color kind of signifies, oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood, and we'll talk more about that in just a bit. Again, this is just another image just summarizing what we've seen. The innermost layer of these blood vessels is the endothelium, and then if you're a vein or artery, you have two more layers that surround that endothelium. If you're a capillary, you just have the one layer, the basal lamina. So capillaries, just understand they're very small. They're actually so small that the red blood cells travel single file, one at a time, or one after another, after another, after another, within the capillary. There's not enough room for them to kind of be two together. They go single file. That's how small capillaries are. And that's why these red blood cells need to be thin and flexible to travel through those very, very, very small vessels. So I do want you to go over how blood flow is controlled in arterioles and capillaries. You can see this famous word that we've seen before, the sphincter, that there's actually some muscles in there that'll help to control it. So do go over this reading to see how blood flow can be controlled. Do know what these parts are over here, and understand how they're controlling blood flow in these smaller types of vessels. Another thing I want you to read up on quickly is the pressure in the vessels. A lot of students, they often think that when the blood goes in the capillaries, well, the pressure should be really high because capillaries are small. They're very, very small diameter, so you should have a higher pressure. But that's actually not really the case. Pressure is actually very low in capillaries. So I want you to go read up on this to get more details on it. But the general idea is that you'll notice that capillaries branch out quite a bit. So even though they're small, they're very small diameter, they branch out so much that that blood kind of gets distributed throughout, and so lowers the overall pressure, which would make sense. That would be important. If your pressure was too high, you might be moving too quickly through the system, and as a result, exchange might be less efficient. So when that blood goes and spreads out into those different branches, it actually lowers the pressure. So please make sure you go over that to understand that concept. You can see the concept of the artery, the arterioles, and the capillaries, and all that division of the blood through the different tubes over here. So one common misconception is deoxygenated versus oxygenated blood. In textbooks, your blood that's oxygenated is, well, red in color, and the blood that's deoxygenated is blue in color. And that's not actually true. Your blood is red all the time. It's really just put like that in textbooks for color coding. So there's no blue blood in humans. There might be blue blood in other types of organisms, but not in humans. So hopefully you can get rid of that misconception. The other thing is, a lot of students think that veins are blue. And veins are actually not blue. They just appear blue through the skin because of the way that the light kind of diffuses through your skin, bounces off the veins, and comes back out, and that's the way you see it, but they're not actually blue. So if you actually cut a cadaver open, when you're studying anatomy, of course, you would see they're not actually blue. And also, if you do dissect an organism, sometimes they are coated red and blue, but that's just because a dye was injected within it to color it. And a lot of students, they often will support the misconception of blue blood by basically saying, well, it was blue, but when I cut myself or when I got injured, the blood came out, oxygen went into it and made it red. No, it was never blue. It was always red. The other thing to remember is that another misconception that students have is they say, well, you know what? Veins carry deoxygenated blood and arteries carry oxygenated blood. And that's not really the case. Sometimes arteries can carry deoxygenated blood, and sometimes veins can carry oxygenated blood. It depends on where they're going to and from. What really defines the vein and the artery, other than their structure, is also the direction of blood. So veins carry blood to the heart, remember, vien, and arteries carry blood away from the heart. So this slide was really just to kind of dispel some common misconceptions. Blood is not blue, veins are not blue, blood is not blue and then oxygenated when it comes out, and that's why it looks red. It's always red. And veins don't necessarily have to carry deoxygenated blood. It's really the direction that matters. It goes to the heart. Arteries don't have to carry oxygenated blood. It goes away from the heart. So we'll see that in more detail in just a bit. As you go through your readings, I do want you to take a look at what this picture is to come up with what it's called and what causes it. Now we're going to go and take a look at the heart. So we saw the blood vessels, we saw the blood itself, and now we'll take a look at the pump of the circulatory system. So it is an organ, so it's made up of many different tissue types. So we have our muscle tissue, connective tissue, nervous tissue, and epithelial tissue. And its goal is to basically pump blood throughout the body. It pumps oxygenated blood throughout the body, and it pumps some deoxygenated blood to the lungs so it can get oxygen. It's not very large, it's about 300 grams, and it's the size of a fist. And so this is a major flow of blood throughout the body. You do need to know this flow. I'm going to go over it with you a few times to make sure you understand it. But basically what happens is you'll see this DO2. DO2 means deoxygenated blood. It will flow from the body into the heart. So the deoxygenated blood is basically a result of body parts taking oxygen from the blood to use it for cellular respiration. And so what happens is that deoxygenated blood comes into the heart through these veins called the vena cava, the inferior and the superior one. Superior one is from the top of the body, inferior one is from the bottom of the body. And they both go into this little chamber, this little room in your heart called the atrium, and specifically they come to the right side of the heart, so it's the right atrium. Remember, even though this is on your left side right now when you're looking at it, it's really the right side of the person's heart that you're studying. And so what happens is that deoxygenated blood will enter the right side of the heart, and then it will go through this valve over here, like a little door that opens up and shuts so that the blood goes one direction only, into the right ventricle. The first valve that it enters is called the tricuspid valve. Tricuspid valve, so you do need to know that name. And it's going to go into the right ventricle, which is this ventricle over here. Now what's going to happen is the ventricle is going to squeeze that blood through this artery over here called the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery. And so what's going to happen is the blood will go through the pulmonary artery and head towards the lungs. Pulm meaning lung. So here it's going to head towards the left lung, and here it's going to head towards the right lung. And so once the blood goes towards the lung, it becomes oxygenated, and then it has to return to the heart. And to return to the heart, it's going to use the pulmonary vein instead, because veins carry blood to the heart. So you're going to have blood from the lungs come through those veins behind the heart. You can't see it here because it's behind the heart, but through the veins, and they're going to enter, instead of the right atrium this time, the left atrium. So the right atrium took the oxygenated blood from the body, the deoxygenated blood from the body. The left atrium is taking the oxygenated blood that came from the lungs. And so what's going to happen now is the blood will go into the left ventricle. It goes through a valve over here called the mitral valve. And then the left ventricle is going to squeeze and pump that blood out into the largest artery of the body called the aorta. On its way out, it went through a valve called the aortic valve. And so now that it went out through the aorta and it was pumped out, it's high pressure, it's going to all the different parts of the body to give those parts of the body oxygen. And so that's the general cycle. We basically see deoxygenated blood come to the right side of the heart, pumped it to the lungs to load it up with some more oxygen. bring it back to the left side, and pump that blood throughout the body through the aorta. And as it did that, we went through some valves, which are, again, flaps of tissue that prevent backflow of blood. And that's the general idea behind blood flow throughout the heart. So we'll go over that in some more detail later on, but you do need to know all these different parts, the different rooms. So the atrium, left and right ones are the top chambers, the top rooms. The ventricles, left and right ones, are the bottom chambers. You need to know what the different valves are called, and we'll go over why they're called different things later on. You need to know the veins that bring blood, deoxygenated blood, to the right side of the heart. You need to know the pulmonary artery and where it goes, and basically anything on this diagram is fair game. So do understand the process and do understand this diagram very, very well. So where is the heart actually located? It's in the middle of the chest. So it is in the middle of the chest. A lot of students say that the heart is actually located on the left side. It's just actually tilted, slightly tilted to the left. Okay, so it is tilted to the left. It is in between your left and your right lung, though. And so remember, we saw the left lung had a cardiac notch to make room for that heart there. So let's go over the structure of the heart in a bit more detail. We've already seen this, but I do want to make sure you understand it. So the heart will beat about 3.5 billion times in the average lifespan. And the heart has 4 rooms or chambers. There's 2 top chambers. Those are called the atria. So you have a right atrium and a left atrium. And there's bottom chambers called the ventricles, a right ventricle and a left ventricle. And you'll notice that they're all separated from other parts by the valve. So we have the atrioventricular valves. We'll go over the names in more detail later on. You still need to know them. Atrioventricular, think about it as atrium, ventricle. And so it's a valve between an atrium and a ventricle. This is the right one. We have a semilunar valve. This is the right semilunar valve between the ventricle and the pulmonary artery away from the heart. And interesting here, look at this, an artery that carries deoxygenated blood. It's carrying it to the lungs. Here we have a left AV valve, atrioventricular valve, between atrium and ventricle, but on the left side. And isn't this interesting over here? See this vein over here? This vein carries blood to the heart, but it has oxygenated blood. So that goes against the idea that veins have to carry deoxygenated all the time. Here we have a valve that goes into the between the ventricle and the aorta on the back side here, just behind here. So this valve here is the left semilunar valve. So you do need to be aware of where the valves are and what they're called, and we'll go over that in more detail in just a bit. And you do need to know the flow. Okay, so again, this is a beautiful diagram because it shows the flow of blood. So deoxygenated blood into the right side of the heart from the body, because all the oxygen is used up, through the pulmonary artery to be delivered to the right and left lungs. And then once they're oxygenated, as you see through these little capillaries surrounding the alveoli, then they can be returned to the left side of the heart, left atrium, left ventricle, for them to be pumped through the aorta throughout the body, where they can lose oxygen again and make their way back to the right side of the heart to be pumped to the lungs again to be re-oxygenated. And so that's the whole flow. This is a good summary of the flow of the heart. Just doesn't have all the parts there, but if you really want to know the flow, study this diagram here. So just more details on each of the chambers. So again, the top chambers are called the atria or atrium singular. The right atrium receives deoxygenated blood with carbon dioxide in it from the body through the superior and inferior vena cava. The right ventricle then takes that deoxygenated blood and pumps it through the pulmonary artery to be delivered to the lungs, the left and the right lung, to become oxygenated. Once the blood has been oxygenated, it returns to the heart via the pulmonary veins, and this time it comes back to the left side of the heart over here, the left atrium, and then that goes down to the left ventricle, again separated by a valve over here, and then pumped out into the aorta to be delivered throughout the body to give oxygen to the other body parts. So the idea is that the right side of the heart is responsible for the pulmonary circuit. So that basically means sending blood to the lung to get oxygenated. And the left side of the heart is primarily responsible for something called the systemic circuit, which basically means circulating blood throughout the body. So our system, our circulatory system, is a two-circuit system. It's a pulmonary circuit, which means one circuit through the lungs and the heart, and then a systemic circuit, which means throughout the rest of the body's system. So that's the left side responsible for systemic, and the right side responsible for the pulmonary circuit. I do want you to understand that not all vertebrates will have a four-chambered heart. This is a good evolution connect that I want you to read up on. Amphibians and reptiles, except for birds, they're going to have three chambers. So they have two atria and a ventricle instead of four chambers like we have, the two atria and two ventricles. So mammals and birds will have the four chamber system, but the amphibians and reptiles only have really the three chambers. So that is a little bit of an evolution connect that you can maybe study and read up on and understand this idea. So one interesting thing to think about is the idea that birds and reptiles, they share a more recent common ancestor with each other than they do with mammals. But mammals and birds both have that four-chambered heart. So is a four-chambered heart an example of analogy or homology when it comes to comparing mammals and birds? Think about that very carefully to connect this back to evolution. So I do want you to briefly read about the evolution of the heart from basically this little primitive one over here to the four-chambered heart that we see over here, just briefly, and understand that development of the septum. So one sentence to summarize what happened. You don't have to memorize all the details, just get that some organisms don't have four-chambered hearts, some do, and this was the proposed evolutionary mechanism for the evolution of that four-chambered heart. So this part over here that separates the left side and the right side of the heart is called the septum, and I need you to understand there's a lot of separation in the heart. So we have separation between the atria and the ventricles, separation between ventricles and major arteries, and those separations occur by the valves. So we have valves that separate atria and ventricles and arteries, and we also have the septum, this thick muscular wall here that separates the left and the right ventricle to prevent mixing of deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood over here. You do need to know what the different valves are called. So we're going to start with the atrioventricular valves, and those are valves between the atrium and the ventricle. So we have an atrioventricular valve over here, and we have one over here as well. And they have different names. So the right one, you can call it the right AV valve, but the name that we give it is the tricuspid valve. And the reason we call it tricuspid is because it has three flaps. So it's based on what it looks like. The one on the left side, of the body is called the bicuspid valve, also called the mitral valve, but bicuspid valve because it has only these two flaps over here. You have a semilunar valve, which is the valve between the left ventricle and the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. So we call that the pulmonary semilunar valve. And then we also have the one that's in between the left ventricle and the aorta, and we call that the aortic semilunar valve. So we can see this pulmonary valve over here. We can see this aortic valve over here. And so that's if we cut open the heart and we aimed it towards you. So we cut open the heart this way, and we rotate it so that the top part is facing you. We would see this structure over here. And the reason I know that is because you can take a look at keywords. Posterior meaning back of the heart, behind. Anterior meaning front of the heart. Now the reason I can see inside this heart is because it was chopped open, and that's what allows you to see inside the heart. So one other important thing about the AV valves, the atrioventricular valves, because they're subject to higher pressure than the semilunar valves are, there's this extra reinforcement here. You can see these strings. These strings, they're colloquially called, or just in common terms called, the heartstrings. They're actually chordae tendineae. They're tendon-like structures that will prevent these valves from reopening when the ventricles, when that high pressure occurs due to ventricular squeezing. And so just know that these are heartstrings or chordae tendineae to prevent these flaps from opening and prevent backflow of blood, since these AV valves are subject to high pressure. And again, here we can see our valves, what they look like when they're open, what they look like when they shut, and then these chordae tendineae can help to keep them shut once they actually do shut, and we don't want them to open again. Another important feature of the heart that you need to be familiar with is something called the pericardium. Peri means surrounding. So it's 2 layers of connective tissue that surround the heart, and they really serve a protective function. Now, these 2 layers are also filled with a fluid, so if you zoom in, you can see the 2 layers here, and there's a fluid called the pericardial fluid. It helps to protect the heart from friction with other tissues and other organs that's found in that rib cage, in that thoracic cavity. So we do have that thin layer of protective tissue called the pericardium that surrounds your heart. And that's similar to that layer that we saw in the lungs. So try to make those connections. Hopefully, if you're studying, you're making connections as you study between the different parts that you studied. And another very important group of blood vessels that's often omitted and we don't discuss but is super important is, well, the blood vessels that feed your heart. So if all cells need oxygen in your body, well, so do the heart cells. If they don't get oxygen, your heart cells die and your heart stops, and then the rest of your body doesn't get oxygen either. So you have these blood vessels called the coronary blood vessels. They're basically the heart's blood supply. And what they do is they're just a network of arteries and veins, and they provide oxygen and nutrients to the cells of your heart. So you have your coronary artery. So this is your aorta over here. Let me just get a different color because we're dealing with red here. And you can see the coronary arteries just kind of branch off the aorta. And so they're going by and feeding the cells of the heart the oxygen and the glucose that they need to survive. And then when you run out of oxygen and all that stuff and nutrients, well, now you can use the coronary veins to go and empty into the right atrium and then right ventricle, so on and so forth. But the idea is that you have coronary arteries that come off the aorta and feed your cells of the heart, and coronary veins will return that blood to the right atrium directly. So this is just a summary of some important vessels that we've seen. So we saw the superior vena cava returns deoxygenated blood from the top of the body to the right atrium. The inferior vena cava brings deoxygenated blood from the bottom of the body to the right atrium. We saw the pulmonary artery, which basically takes deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle and sends it to the left lung and the right lung to get oxygenated in the lung through that gas exchange we saw in the respiratory system. We have the pulmonary vein. Once the blood has been oxygenated, the pulmonary veins deliver the oxygenated blood from the lungs, left and right lungs, to the left atrium, and then in the left atrium it goes to the left ventricle. But then we have this artery over here called the aorta to deliver the oxygenated blood to the body, and the aorta is the largest artery in the body. What we saw in the previous slide, we also saw the coronary system, which basically helps to feed the heart. We have coronary artery and coronary veins as well. Those are important, don't forget them. So this is a summary of the two circuits that we saw. We saw the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. Again, pulmonary circuit is really governed primarily by the right side of the heart, and it sends the deoxygenated blood to the lung to get oxygenated. So you can see that over here we have the right side of the heart pumping blood through that pulmonary artery to go through the lung. You can see over here it's blue at first, and then it becomes red as it goes through the alveoli in the lungs, and then we come back to the left side of the heart, which is going to start a systemic circuit where the blood pumps that oxygenated blood throughout the body. It's red. We get to the capillaries, basically to the tissues, to the organs, to the cells. Oxygen is lost and it becomes blue because we give oxygen away, we pick up carbon dioxide, then we return to the right side of the heart to go through the whole cycle over and over again. So what we saw are two circuits, the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. Some organisms actually only have a single circuit, so it's really easy to understand two-circuit, double-circuit system versus single-circuit system if you see an example of a single circuit. So here we have a fish with a single-circuit system. We have the atrium over here, and that's going to receive deoxygenated blood. That blood is going to go into the ventricle. It's going to be pumped to the gills where oxygenation is going to happen, so the blood will become oxygenated, and it's not going to return to the heart. It's actually just going to continue going around to the body. Oxygen will be used up, come back to the heart, back to the gills rather, not lungs because we're dealing with a fish here. Back to the body, back to the heart, back to the gills, back to the body, back to the heart, back to the gills. So the single circuit, you really are not returning to the heart after you've been oxygenated. You're going directly to the body. In the double circuit, we go to the lungs first, then we go to the heart, the lungs, then back to the heart, then to the body. So we do like 2 stops of the heart before going back to the body in our double circuit. Again, here's our lovely summary. This time what I've done in this summary is I've actually included the organs over here that are doing the oxygenation. They're oxygenating the blood. And so remember, that's what these structures here represent in those pictures when oxygenation is happening. And over here you can see the top part of the body for getting rid of oxygen from the blood. And over here you can see the bottom part of the body. So this picture has been filled out with all that, with all the little details that we've studied. And this picture summarizes the different circuits that we saw. You can see highlighted in yellow is our systemic circuit. You can see highlighted in this green color over here is our pulmonary circuit. And this really does help you understand the flow of blood throughout the body. So remember that flow, remember the details, go back and fill in diagrams, practice diagrams. There's a lot of worksheets online that will assist you in doing that. So in the lungs, which we saw earlier, we see the gas exchange happening. So part of that pulmonary circuit is this piece happening here. So when we see that blue become red, it's because of that oxygen going into the blood and the carbon dioxide coming out of the blood, and then this will be delivered back to the left side of the heart so it can be pumped throughout the body. But again, that main idea is that we see a connection between the circulatory system through the capillaries and the respiratory system through the alveoli over here. So remember to review diffusion and concentration. The idea that when diffusion happens, it goes from high concentration to low concentration. In the alveoli or alveolus here, there's a high concentration of O2, and in the blood over here, it was deoxygenated when it first went by, so it was a low concentration of O2, and that's why the oxygen went from the alveolus into the red blood cell, and it's the opposite for the carbon dioxide. It was a high concentration of CO2 over here, and low over here, and that's why it went into the alveolus and you could breathe it out. And then when we go to the tissues, it's kind of the other way around. There's a high concentration of O2 on the red blood cell when you're going to the systemic circuit because you just received oxygen, and low in the cells, so that's why oxygen can flow this way. There's a high concentration of CO2 because the cells have been using up oxygen through cellular respiration, and now they want to get rid of it so they can diffuse so that CO2 can diffuse out into the red blood cell, since it's low CO2 now, since we just got rid of it up over here. So this is just showing that gas exchange. We kind of bypass the heart here, but understand that, at this, before going to the body, this blood here would go back to the heart to be pumped to the body, and then we would see this part here. Okay, but it's just going over the idea of gas exchange within the lungs and within the tissues, and it relies on a concentration difference. There has to be high concentration to low concentration for this to happen effectively. And we say that's going down a concentration gradient. Just a little bit more detail on hemoglobin, because it is an important molecule, and I do want you to understand the relation to genetics. So this is a protein. Since it's a protein, you know that it was coded for by a gene. So if your hemoglobin gene is not working properly, this protein won't work properly, and you won't be able to hold oxygen as well as you'd like. But it is called a respiratory pigment. There's 4 protein subunits, so basically 4 big proteins that are kind of connected together to make it, and they're each coded for by a gene. And they contain this thing called a heme group, which contains iron and binds 1 oxygen. And remember, as I said earlier, each red blood cell has 250 million hemoglobin molecules. So what that means is they can each hold 1 billion oxygen molecules. Okay, because remember that each, so here we have each subunit has a heme group. Each subunit can hold 1 O2. So O2 here, O2 here. If you have 2 hemoglobin molecules with these heme groups, you can hold 8 oxygens. But when you have 250 million, you can hold, 8. So when you have 250 million, you can hold 4 times that, 1 billion. All right. So it's important that you understand the interactions between the different systems. This diagram primarily shows the interaction between the circulatory system and the respiratory system. You can see blood being pumped to the lung as a respiratory system to become oxygenated, and then back to the heart to be delivered throughout the body. So we see our circulatory system interacting with our respiratory system. Do understand the main connections, especially those capillaries. Those are super important. Right, so you can see here the capillaries not only interacting with the respiratory system, but also interacting with the digestive system. So those capillaries are found in those villi to absorb nutrients. So in the respiratory system, we saw capillaries are taking the oxygen from the alveoli to deliver throughout the body. And in the digestive system, we saw that we are taking the glucose and organic fuel from the digestive system into the blood to deliver throughout the body, and then the circulatory system pumps that through to the cells, so cellular respiration can happen. So do understand those interactions, do understand the contributions of those different systems towards cellular respiration. To finish off, we're going to take a look at just a brief introduction to heart disease and stroke. You'll be responsible for going over the circulatory system diseases yourself. There's a PowerPoint online with some guiding questions to go over. So you do need to know symptoms and general descriptions of each condition. But I want to focus a bit on one condition called a blood clot. And a blood clot is when you have basically a buildup of cholesterol, fat, and other things, other ions in your blood vessels, and it creates this blockage called plaque. And that prevents blood from flowing properly, and it also makes this space smaller and therefore increases blood pressure. So you have an increase in blood pressure, which can harden your arteries even more and then make them less elastic, and that makes it even more likely for, well, blood to get stuck there, and that's what we really call the blood clot. So you have a lot of plaque that builds up because of poor diet perhaps, or even genetics that can play a role. Even if you have a really good diet sometimes, if you have genetics that lead to high cholesterol, then maybe the blood clot can still happen if you're really not careful about your diet. So what happens is this blood clot happens and blood stops flowing. So if blood stops flowing and does not reach your heart, so suppose you have a blood clot in the coronary artery, then your blood cells will starve and they're going to start to die, and you might suffer a heart attack. So you have a blood clot in your heart or somewhere preventing blood from reaching your heart, you can have a heart attack and your blood cells die. If your your heart cells die. If they die, then your heart can't pump anymore, and then the rest of your body doesn't get oxygen, which is a really bad thing. Another thing that could happen is you could have a blood clot in your brain. So sometimes you might have a blockage in your brain that prevents blood flow, and now your brain cells start to die, and that's what we call a stroke. That's what we call a stroke. And that's really not a good thing. If you don't get it taken care of, you can suffer irreversible damage. So as soon as you know you have a stroke, someone needs to help you. You need to get that checked out. There's a video online posted about strokes to let you know what the signs and symptoms are. It's good for everyone to know those signs and symptoms, and you can remember it by the acronym FAST. So go watch that video. It's useful for you. One of my colleagues actually suffered a stroke while she was leaving one of her classes at med school. She felt the symptoms come on, and she was actually able to go find somebody in a car and say, I think I'm having a stroke, can you drive me to the hospital? And because she acted quickly and knew the symptoms of the stroke, she was actually able to prevent irreversible damage, and she went back to school and she was perfectly fine later on through some rehab, of course. But the point is that she acted fast. So please make sure you go over that video. It can save your life. It can save a friend's life. It can save a family member's life. Go over that video. Super important to understand. Sometimes when you do have a blood clot or arteries that are very constricted because of this plaque, you can do something called an angioplasty, where the surgeon basically puts this little balloon pump into your blood vessels and then just pumps, tries to open up that space a bit more, that blockage, to make room for the blood to go through it. And then after that, you might need to take medication, monitor your diet to prevent this from closing up again. So that is called balloon angioplasty. We can put a stent in there to keep it open so that, again, it doesn't close back up again. So you will need to read up on the different conditions and diseases of the circulatory system, such as arteriosclerosis, atherosclerosis, coronary artery disease. You should know what they are, what their symptoms are, what factors can cause them, how they can lead to heart attacks, and maybe some treatments as well for them. There is a PowerPoint that summarizes these and goes over the major concepts, along with some guiding questions. So please go over that. That's super important. You will see it appear, or may see it appear on a test, exam, or assessment of some sort, maybe an interview as well. Again, it's important that you understand the interactions between the various systems. So this picture kind of summarizes that here. You can see the body looked at in an interesting way from a top view here. And we have our digestive system, and you can see that nutrients will go by and will be absorbed into that circulatory system, and whatever is not is excreted as waste. Over here you can see our respiratory system, and oxygen comes in and oxygen will go into the bloodstream. So we have a circulatory system here, and that will distribute some of those nutrients and oxygen to these cells. We'll also see our blood go through this urinary system with our kidneys to kind of get rid of some liquid waste products as well. So we can see that circulatory system is connecting many of these systems together to help them accomplish various tasks. So if you understand this picture, you do understand the big idea of the interactions that exist between the various systems. You should read over your notes, complete the Nelson readings, and do the worksheets that are posted online, along with the practice labeling diagrams posted online, especially those heart diagrams. They will be important. There will be a variety of diagrams on your next unit test, so please make sure that you go over all the diagrams so you know how to label them effectively.